Thank you so much for coming today. We're going to get started since the room looks pretty packed. So on behalf of the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, I wanted to thank everyone for coming here. This is a part of our seminar series, which goes throughout each semester. And today we would like to present Ron Deibert, who is the director of the Citizen Lab and a political science professor at the University of Toronto, Munk School of Global Affairs. So for those who are unfamiliar with the organization, the Citizen Lab conducts in-depth investigations on technical breaches that affect human rights activists, political dissidents, and other civil society actors. And the reports have resulted in numerous patches and other security updates, and generally tend to make a big impact on the field. And more generally, Dr. Deibert has worked on internet freedom throughout his career. He's a former founder and principal investigator at the OpenNet Initiative and a founder of Psiphon. He's also authored a number of books on internet censorship, surveillance, espionage, and cybersecurity. And fun fact, he was appointed to the Order of Ontario and awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal for being among the first to recognize and take measures to mitigate growing threats to communications rights, openness, and security worldwide. And we're very, very excited to have him here today. And
thank you very much, Kristen. Thank you, and thanks everyone for, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming out. I'm really glad to be here and connect with so many friends and colleagues here at Berkeley. So let me begin just a bit of background about the Citizen Lab. So I'm a political scientist, but a lot of the work that the lab does is technical in nature, and we do focus on digital security issues, but not just any old digital security issues. This is a big field, so we narrow our focus around digital security issues that arise out of human rights concerns. So we're interested in documenting surveillance, mass surveillance, targeted surveillance, internet censorship. We've done a lot of work over 10-year period documenting national level information controls. More recently, we're into mobile privacy and security issues, trying to better understand the applications that are inside our devices, what risks they may contain for users. The real secret sauce of the Citizen Lab is our mixture of methods. So, as I said, I'm a political scientist, but among the staff of the Citizen Lab, computer scientists, engineering science, political science, area studies, law, we really do combine methods and insights, techniques and skills from all these different disciplines to all of the reports that we do. And I think it's quite unique in that regard. You often hear a lot about interdisciplinary centers and institutes and so on, and we've been practicing this for quite a long time. I think it's been pretty successful. The one other thing I'd say that important to clarify is we're not an activist group or an advocacy group. Obviously there's a normative perspective to what we do. We wouldn't be doing this research if we didn't care about it. And as individuals, many of us speak openly about issues we care about and advocate for certain positions. But when it comes to the lab's work, it's very much resting on impartial, evidence-based, peer-reviewed research. And we see ourselves filling a kind of niche in the human rights space in that regard. There are many activist groups, advocacy groups, they do a good job. We don't want to spread ourselves too thin. Instead, we want to supply very careful evidence-based research that can help inform some of the policy debates. We work in several different areas, as I say here, but what I'm going to talk about today concerns one major area of Citizen Lab's work, which we call targeted digital threats. This is primarily about tracking and better understanding espionage as it affects civil society. And in this area, typically our projects start with a patient zero, like this person, Ahmad Mansour. Unfortunately, I believe he's still incarcerated. About 3 weeks ago, he was detained for his work as a human rights defender in the UAE. Now, I imagine many people in this room might know about this case because it has to do with the wonderful Bill Marzak, who's sitting right here, who's a Citizen Lab research fellow and all-around amazing person. So. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but Bill, if you forgive me, I'll go through the story and you can correct me later if I'm wrong. But Ahmad Mansour, as a human rights defender, He, back in August last year, received these SMS messages. And if you read Arabic, they purport to show evidence of some kind of abuse in UAE prisons, something he might be tempted to click on. Instead, thankfully, he did not click on those links. He forwarded them to Bill for analysis. And I do recall, I think, when Bill received those SMS messages, he knew immediately what he was dealing with. Bill had been tracking an infrastructure of a commercial spyware company that related to a prior report that Bill had been working on in the UAE, where he found little indicators, data that relates to this infrastructure that was used by this particular spyware company. So after much analysis, he was able to determine that this was actually targeting going on by an Israeli cyber warfare company called the NSO Group. If you Google the NSO Group, you'd probably only come up with either profiles of Bill or our reports. They're not the type of company that has a big brochure website. They don't advertise what they do. They in their brochures that show up at trade shows, they say that they're a cyber warfare company. These are veterans of Israel's very advanced signals intelligence agency 8200, Unit 8200, which is unique in terms of signals intelligence agencies, very entrepreneurial culture. So you have many spin-offs. This is one of them, a surveillance company. They also say we only sell to governments and we follow Israeli and local laws. And the reason that I single that out is because both of those are true, and yet we had this strange situation where the United Arab Emirates government contracting with an Israeli cyber warfare company to try to get inside the device of a human rights defender. So this is high-level stuff. Had Ahmad Mansour clicked on those links, he would have been his iPhone would have been exploited by the Pegasus, what we call the Trident exploit chain. They would have been able to access everything within his device, including being able to read all of his emails, even those that are encrypted, look at all of his SMS messages, turn on the camera, use the device as a audio capture system to eavesdrop on ambient sound within a room, for example. And of course, all of this is integrated into quite advanced data analytical platform to be able to track his movements and so on. What was targeting Ahmad was very, very sophisticated. It involved 3 separate Apple zero days. Now, those of you who know the FBI Apple San Bernardino controversy know that the FBI ended up paying close, I think it was over $1 million to get inside that one iPhone. So each of these exploits can run upwards of $1 million. And as I said, this involved 3 separate 0 days. So it shows you the lengths to which this one government would go to get inside the device of this one human rights defender. After Bill made the discovery, our team got together and did a responsible disclosure to Apple. And I think it was within 12 days, if I'm not mistaken, from the time that the SMS messages were given to Bill, and Apple released its patch. So this is a remarkably short period of time for something so substantial to come out. Every iPhone and MacBook, OS X Safari received a patch affecting close to 1 billion, maybe even more than 1 billion Apple users worldwide. So when funders often ask researchers about impacts of the research of their lab, and this has got to be one of the biggest ones ever, thanks to Bill and our team. Now, you may be asking yourselves, well, how did Ahmad Mansour know to share those suspicious links with Bill and the Citizen Lab? And the reason is because we had done 2 prior reports with Ahmad Mansour. Going back to 2011, he was targeted by presumably his own government, this time using a British company, Finfisher. Then in 2012, the Italian company Hacking Team, and then finally the NSO Group. We called the report the $1 Million Dissident because as far as we know, Ahmad Mansour is the only activist human rights defender to be targeted by his own government using 3 separate companies' infrastructure. Very expensive stuff. Now, with all of our reports, we publish indicators of compromise. We try to get as much information out about what we're investigating. And the reason that we want to do that is we hope that maybe network administrators, system administrators will be able to fix their systems, protect their users, but also we're hoping that maybe there'll be other targets, or maybe other researchers in some part of the world will identify the information that we're releasing, will come back to us and help. And indeed, that happened in this case. So with the $1 million dissident report, we had some evidence of Mexican targeting as well, based on the research that Bill and John Scott Railton did. Few months went by and we got a outreach from civil society organizations in Mexico. Turns out that some people had phoned an advocacy group's helpline, Access Now, and reported some suspicious links, and the local civil society groups recognized them from our reports and again forwarded them to us for analysis. Well, it turned out that some agency within the Mexican state had contracted with this same Israeli cyber warfare company, this time to target advocates of attacks on sugary beverages in Mexico. Believe it or not, this is a serious enough issue to warrant that type of surveillance in Mexico. You might ask yourself, why? Who could be against? Obesity is a big issue in Mexico, consumption of these sugary beverages. Campaigners, health advocates, research scientists like this person want to put a tax on sugary beverages to try to deal with the problem. There are vested interests in Mexico, obviously connected to the commerce around sugary beverages, which is a very profitable market, that want to prevent that from happening. So again here, we released a report, and I'm sure in this one that will lead to yet more reports down the road for us. But what this illustrates, I think, is the thesis that I want to put out there, that there's a real crisis right now in civil society around these type of targeted attacks. We've seen many different variations of this, so not all of them are as sophisticated as ones that use very fancy Apple 0 days costing millions of dollars. There was a report that was authored by John Scott Railton at the Citizen Lab, where he uncovered a targeted attack campaign that stretched back over 8 years across many countries in Latin America, targeting journalists, civil society, opposition groups. In this case, though, using not sophisticated spyware sold by a Western company, but instead very common remote access tools, essentially the techniques of crimeware. We've done at least 5 separate reports on targeted attacks in the context of Syria. Again there, whether it's the Syrian Electronic Army, whether it's the Assad regime, whether it's groups coming from outside, Iranian-sponsored actors. There's kind of a piling on going on in Syria where opposition groups are being assaulted with not sophisticated spyware, but stuff that is actually the technique and tradecraft of cybercrime. But it works. It's very effective. Indeed, there are case after case I could go through of activists, lawyers, journalists from many different parts of the world who have been our patient zeros over the last 5 or 6 years, where we've seen whether it's fancy software, off-the-shelf computer crimeware being targeted by their own governments, their networks infiltrated, and their devices compromised, all in an attempt to shut down what they're doing, which typically involves doing something adversarial to an entrenched power, typically the government that they're advocating against. Now, I think some of you might say, well, maybe there's some kind of selection bias here because, you're getting these cases coming at you. How can you say there's a crisis in civil society? You're not looking at all of civil society. Well, in fact, we did something, maybe not looking at all of civil society, but we did a comparative report for what it's worth. We enrolled 10 groups over a period of 4 years. And these are non-governmental organizations of various sizes, various portfolios. Over that time, they shared with us data concerning targeting of their computers. 44 distinct malware families were analyzed. We also did in-depth qualitative research. We interviewed them to find out the impacts of all of this. And there were many takeaways of this study, but the one that struck me the most was that these organizations that were enrolled in our study were being targeted by the very same threat actors that you hear about in the news, targeting government and industry. Groups like this one. You may remember a few years back, the security company Mandiant released a report where they actually identified members of the People's Liberation Army associated with this constant cyber espionage against mostly US industry and government. And as a result of this, the United States government took quite a dramatic measure to actually indict these individuals. But if you read the indictment and you read the research about it, what's overlooked is the fact that this very same threat actor targets civil society routinely. In fact, in our major study, we have a whole detailed section of that very actor called APT1, compromising a very large human rights organization that was enrolled in our study, had access to their entire network for many years. President Obama and President Xi, not that long ago, signed an agreement. Many people saw it very positively. I think it was a positive step where they said, look, we need to come to some arrangement here. Let's try to work on some norms where we both agree that we won't use our powerful signals intelligence capabilities to steal intellectual property or attack critical infrastructure. And as a consequence, some of the people in the security industry started noting and publishing reports saying, hey, we're noticing there's a big drop in Chinese-based cyber espionage campaigns. Well, again, Citizen Lab's a small group. We don't have visibility over all of civil society, but I can tell you we haven't noticed any drop in the reporting that we're doing concerning the groups that are part of our network of study subjects. So I think actually this Obama-Xi agreement may have had the unintended effect of actually displacing some of that energy and resources, giving it a kind of green light to the Chinese to say, hey, don't attack our industry, don't attack our government. When it comes to civil society, well, we'll just turn a blind eye. I hope that's not the case, but I suspect it's so. And it speaks to a larger issue. So you can't open a newspaper today without some consideration of Russian cyber espionage. And all of the attention really has been around the possibility that the Russian-affiliated actors got inside the Clinton organization and the DNC. But what is entirely overlooked, of course, is that from the Russian perspective, they're looking at civil society as equal in significance to government and industry and organizations like the DNC. That's not reported on. You don't hear it. You don't see it in the industry reports. This is an industry report that looked at that one of those Russian-affiliated threat actors, broke down the categories of targets that were compromised, and you see that more than a third here are civil society organizations. Why don't they talk about them? Well, it's quite simple answer, actually. Civil society don't have money to pay these big companies. They're not seen as profitable clients. So there's a real market failure here. Their needs are not being addressed. Now, we've seen in our research over the last 10 years many different forms of targeted attacks. And I think there's an impression people have that highly sophisticated countries are able to do that. That's certainly true. There are some that have these nation-state resources. We've seen commercial spyware. This is where companies, even if you don't have internal capacity, but you do have a lot of money, a country like Ethiopia, for example, you can go out and purchase off commercial spyware from one of these companies and build your own NSA, if you will. And then there's the final category, my cousin can hack, we call it, which is also effective. You have these essentially taking the tradecraft of cybercrime and using it for political espionage. It's very effective. Why? Because it just is enough technical sophistication is all you need to compromise a network and get inside it. Now, looking at the civil society side, and underlying why I think there's a real crisis here is because when you look at the organizations that make up civil society, the conditions are ripe for an epidemic. Generally speaking, most civil society organizations have very low IT capacity. They typically have one person who has to, plug in the printer or put in the projector, let alone deal with very advanced persistent threats. They have obvious resource constraints. They can't go out and hire a company like Mandiant or FireEye or Trend Micro to deal with their issues. Most of them have a lack of basic policies and security practices when it comes to dealing with cybersecurity. Especially in the global south, we find that software can be unpatched for many, many years. So when you see something in the news like a leak of powerful exploits coming from the NSA, from shadow brokers. We hear that Microsoft quickly patched it. The problem is a lot of the organizations that are in civil society are dealing with outdated software. Maybe they don't even know how to patch their software appropriately, or they don't have the money to buy properly licensed software. So many of those exploits will end up targeting them. Frankly, for a lot of them, digital security threats aren't the big issue for them, especially if they're dealing with life and death issues that seem more close to them. And for them, we'll just park that aside and not deal with it. Of course, there's lots of misinformation as well. A lot of folk wisdom going around. Use this tool, use that tool, do this, click on this, don't do that. But a lot of it is not systematic. What we can say, though, is that attacks are really disrupting work, safety, and trust within civil society, which is interesting when you think about the narrative we've all been accustomed to over the last 20 years about the relationship between civil society and the internet. Many of us thought these technologies would be inherently empowering, and they were for a good period of time, but we're now seeing the opposite happening. It's like sand is being put in the machinery of civil society. Suddenly everything's slowing down. People are paranoid. They're not sure who to trust within their networks. It takes a lot longer to send and retrieve information than it did in the past. I also think things are going to get a lot worse, unfortunately, before they get better. I seem to be a person who gives a lot of presentations like this, and yet I can still laugh about it. But anyway, this is my assessment, evidence-based, impartial assessment. I actually think things are going to get a bit worse. And some of this is at a kind of high level. So I think generally the problem with security and information technology affects civil society as a whole. And that is, we've connected at a pace that far outstrips our ability to secure ourselves. And this applies to all of society, not just civil society, but it's especially acute for the reasons I just outlined concerning capacity and resources when it comes to civil society. And of course, this is getting much, much worse very quickly with the Internet of Things, with everything being networked. There's so many applications, protocols, developers from many different countries. And of course, countries themselves are the problem here in this equation as well. Many countries are actually building into their infrastructure insecurity by design to assist law enforcement, to assist intelligence agencies. One of the streams of research that we have going on at the Citizen Lab is to reverse engineer popular mobile applications, mostly based in China. And what we're finding is that many of them contain hidden surveillance or censorship functionalities. This is essentially building insecurity into an application. Many governments don't disclose vulnerabilities that they hear about. What's known as the vulnerabilities equities process is really only discussed in the United States. And even there's very little that we know about what the process actually entails. For most countries in the world, there is no process whatsoever, or it's not openly talked about. We also have a kind of interesting phenomenon, I believe, at an international level when it comes to strategic relationships and threats between states. If you follow the cyber warfare, cybersecurity literature, some of the policy around this, there's a lot of concern about cyber warfare and electronic Pearl Harbor, that governments with these extraordinary capabilities will attack each other. In fact, what's happening, I think, is that deterrence is actually working in cyberspace. Just because you have capabilities doesn't mean you'll necessarily use them. So for the same reason that we don't see nuclear warfare breaking out all the time, governments are restrained from using those very powerful capabilities against each other because they are mutually entangled in cyberspace. There's a lot of deterrence at work. Now that doesn't mean, a madman couldn't unleash something irrational. Obviously, we're living in a period right now where that remote possibility is less and less remote. So maybe this bullet point will have to change. But you know what? If that did happen, then we wouldn't have to worry about my presentation or the bullet point at all. However, assuming that this rational deterrence is actually manifesting itself in cyberspace, and I do think it does, even for a country like North Korea. They have a stake in cyberspace in order to derive revenues from the black market for what they do. What happens, though, is there's this kind of perverse consequence. My colleague John Lindsay has written a lot about this, where states, they still want to compete against each other. They're engaged in geopolitical competition. They have a lot of resources. So what we're seeing is a lot of the attention is being put into the covert area. And we live in a golden age of cyber espionage right now. Covert action, disinformation is on the rise. There's also this. If you go back 20 years ago and read, for example, Samuel Huntington's The Third Wave, after the end of the Cold War, people expected there would be a wave of democratization. And we did see that for a while. But what we're finding now is really democracies in retreat. Governments that have gone through democratic transitions are sliding back into authoritarianism. The Economist, not a left-leaning publication, prior to the Trump election, downgraded the United States to a flawed democracy. And just today, I heard on the news that President Trump phoned Erdogan and congratulated him on this referendum. So I think, this speaks to the time that we're in, where authoritarianism is resurgent, flawed democracies, illiberal democracies are on the rise. I think this is something that's also a little bit hard to talk about for some people maybe, but again, it's a fact. One of the unintended consequences of the Snowden disclosures, and generally speaking, as someone who worked on them for over a year with the Canadian media, I fully appreciated the importance of getting those in the public domain. Nonetheless, they've had an ironic consequence where they've kind of normalized what before was hidden in the shadows. It's now not only kind of taken for granted, I don't believe there's been very meaningful rollback of anything that's gone on. Quite the opposite. We've seen legalization of it. But more importantly, in the developing world, it's given many countries a blueprint, a roadmap, how to build your own NSA, especially when it comes to enlisting the help of the private sector to engage in mass and targeted surveillance. Lastly, we have this unregulated spyware industry with proven abuse potential. And I talked a bit about this already. Again, going back to some of our prior projects, those of you who follow Citizen Lab may have seen that thanks to Bill and other members of the team who were able to very carefully map the command and control infrastructure of some of these companies, we were able to actually pinpoint some of the clients. And the picture here is very depressing, basically. It's that these companies are selling their very advanced spyware capabilities to some of the world's most notorious abusers of human rights. This is the Italian company, Hacking Team. I believe when this report was done, there were actually export controls in Italy that should have prevented these type of sales. Obviously, they didn't work. Finfisher, British-German company, same deal. By the way, the research behind this, I find, as an aside, some of the most remarkable of the work that's been done at the Citizen Lab, and I really encourage people who are interested in that to talk to Bill more about exactly how that's done, because it's phenomenal. NSO group, although we didn't do a map, I thought this was interesting from the $1 Million Dissident Report. These were themes of domains that Bill and John were able to discover in the infrastructure connected to the NSO group, which, it's not a smoking gun in terms of clients of the company, but it's highly unlikely there'd be these country themes were these countries not involved in some way in the spyware infrastructure of this company. And you can see, again, some of the world's most notorious abusers of human rights. We have leaks that have come from the companies themselves. So Hacking Team, the Italian company, and Finfisher for that matter, were both ironically hacked, and all of their corporate data was posted on WikiLeaks. And so if you go through the spy files, you can read about how they very cavalierly treated human rights issues. They talk publicly about having corporate social responsibility and internal governance to prevent abuse. They follow the law, etc. But the reality is, of course, they're just going after whatever contracts they have. I'm not sure what happened there.
Sorry. See you.
There we go. Thank you. And also, within the breached corporate internal confidential emails, very interesting to read that the CEO of the company was asking his legal team how they could prevent Citizen Lab from doing the type of research I do. It's time that we hit Citizen Lab hard. And I'm wondering about the feasibility of any legal action against Citizen Lab. Yes, we have been sued. We're prepared for that. There's a documentary that just came out from Al Jazeera about the spyware industry. I believe it's called The Spy Merchants. And investigative journalists went undercover, posing as a buyer for countries like Iran, Sudan, went to many different companies, and you can see some of the reactions here. First, we are okay with Iran. Of course, it's subject to export restrictions, but this is something that we can manage. And then you have a Chinese vendor. We don't know who is the end user, and we don't care. We have done it before. I think I highly recommend this documentary. It shows you exactly the norms around this industry and why it's a big problem. So what do we do about all of this? So I'm going to lay out what I think are some practical things that we could do immediately, and then the bigger issues. So in terms of practical things that could be done, I think there is a market failure in this area. So you have civil society groups that are being increasingly targeted. I do think it's a very dangerous epidemic that really cuts at the core of liberal democracy and human rights. And yet governments aren't really speaking out about it. And you have the private sector with a lot of data, a lot of resources, and they don't really know how to apply them. So, and meanwhile, there's research groups like our own that are trying to expose the targeting and abuses. I think coordination and collaboration, there's a lot more of this that could happen to help remedy. Industry can also take efforts to protect their own users. We've seen Google state-sponsored warnings on people's emails now. That's one illustration of the type of thing companies can do more of to actually raise the bar to two-factor authentication. Making that requirement would really undermine a lot of the attacks that we see at the Citizen Lab. A very simple step like that. When it comes to the spyware industry, I think there are measures that could be taken around applying existing criminal law or civil law. For example, if I'm spied on in Canada and it's not done because of under some warrant, I'm not doing something illegal like a lot of the ground zero patients that we have, that's against Canadian law. There's a case where a person represented by EFF is suing the government of Ethiopia in, I believe it's in the state of Maryland. Unfortunately, that case was thrown out by a judge, and it's going to go to another level, but I think it's an interesting example of how we might hold some of these companies to account by developing new approaches to regulating commercial spyware. One thing I will say that I've noticed and others have noticed is a lot of the espionage we see coming from these commercial spyware companies involves fake or fraudulent uses of company infrastructure, which is essentially a trademark violation. So I think some of the companies could get their resources and assets together to really clamp down on some of the abuse that's going on. I do believe there's a big role for more of the type of work that we do. Citizen Lab is a very unusual place, and honestly, I don't know why exactly there aren't many Citizen Labs all over the place. Because the work that we do, although there are geniuses involved like Bill, there are many geniuses around the world. The university talks a lot about interdisciplinary research. Rarely is it practiced. And I think that this is a problem having to do with a fundamental issue around the university environment, that we operate in silos. So you have engineering and computer science students. They're trained in all of the techniques and methods. Maybe they have one course, a required course on like public policy or ethics or something like that, and no outlet for this type of activity. Meanwhile, in the social sciences, very little training in the technology. And I think that really needs to change, because universities obviously have very special skills, amazing resources. It's an environment that offers a bridge to industry and civil society. Of course, it's a place, in ideal terms, where controversial research such as this should be not only protected, but actually encouraged. That's the whole point of getting tenure, is you should be able to do this type of research to speak freely against powerful, entrenched interests. But I really do feel that the window for this is narrowing, unfortunately, for the same reason that democracy is in retreat. Citizen Lab couldn't exist doing what it does in Indonesia or in Kenya. It's at the University of Toronto in Canada, and thankfully my university has stood up for us and protected the research that we do, but not all universities are that way. Meanwhile, the money that's coming in from the intelligence, from the security services, into British universities, into American universities, requiring researchers to sign NDAs, limiting their ability to speak freely, I think is a very, very dangerous omen that we need to resist. Lastly, let me just say the big picture here. I think, ultimately to change this will require addressing fundamental problems that are challenging democracy and human rights writ large. Part of that, I think, will require, maybe it'll take a generation or so, but how we think about cyberspace. I know a lot of people don't like that term, call it whatever you want. The digital communications environment that surrounds us right now is being carved up, militarized, fought over, all sorts of proprietary protections that divide it up. I think we need to encourage people to think differently about it in the same way that we think about the environment, or should think about the environment, I should say, as a global commons, as something that is valuable to everybody around the world. In fact, is necessary for the survival of the species. If we're going to survive as a species, we need to have a shared repository of information and knowledge, a place that we can communicate freely, that requires stewardship over. That type of mentality change, a collective mindset change, will take, of course, a long time. And it faces many uphill battles, but only then will we have changes in institutions, practices, laws, ethics, and so on that will remedy all of this. But getting to here, from before, there are many small practical steps we can take in between. So I'll end it there and welcome questions and comments from all of you. Thank you. Yes.
I was really glad you mentioned kind of industry ways forward to advocate for users. For example, Gmail is kind of, you might be surveilled by the state right now. And I was wondering what you think of unintended effects of that, if any, of shilling users. Kind of letting them know, like, you're being watched.
Yeah.
They can't tell you precisely by whom or how, but you want to give some notice. Like, do you think there's a way to mitigate that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know I've not only read about, but I've spoken to people who've felt that way. What's going on? They panic and they think something's going on. So, you know, I think there'll be some learning around this that has to happen. And unfortunately, those companies are concerned about liabilities, right? They don't want to get too deep into the warnings, because that could head them down a path where they might either misinform somebody, open themselves up to maybe some legal challenges, alienate a customer. So there are all sorts of pitfalls, and it's not perfect right now, but at least it's a step, I think, in the right direction that we together as a community can work on improving, is the way that I would think about that. But yeah, I know it is having a chilling effect for sure. Yes, sir.
Going to get on to a question in a second, but you might find it of interest. I worked in the university in Ireland that used to do the cryptography for the IRA.
Okay.
And we were quite public about it. We actually published technical reports saying we've cracked the military codes in Northern Ireland. Okay. And we would teach it to our students. We graduated about 50 students every year who was actually able to do this. It's interesting to see how things have unfolded.
No doubt.
But that's not my question. The question is actually more about your worries about academic freedom. Here's the scenario that I see. If you cut down on academic freedom like that, you're not going to attract the bright students. This is the irony. You can't really crack down on academic freedom within the universities like that without having an absolutely comprehensive attack on freedom of speech throughout the whole society in general. Because really, the brighter students are going to say, well, I'm not really going to go to Jubilee University because, look, all that stuff there is really out on the web, which is obviously of better quality. So that's the first thing I'd like to consider.
Can I address that now?
Please.
So I'm not so sure about that, because I think, you know, money is very attractive, and if the industries behind it are avenues for jobs, and you know, there's so much stock in innovation and employment right now as a motivating factor, that I really worry that students wouldn't be making the calculations that you think they are. I hope they do, but I think unfortunately many people are attracted to the prospect of money, resources, fancy tools, prospects for employment down the road.
May I follow up?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Sure. So let's say that Google has got a choice between hiring somebody from Jubilee University with 120 credits from there, or somebody who's taken 120 credits from Coursera and edX, and everything is public and right out there. Surely Google is going to think, well, really, you know, this is a...
I hope so.
But with respect to how it happened, I think that you might find it interesting to look at the, I'm sorry, I'm going to finish at this point, the centralization of funding within departments in America happens after the Bayh-Dole Act. So that's actually why there are so few...
I'm not familiar with that act.
That's in the early 80s.
Okay.
And then funding became channeled through the departments, which actually not just destroyed institutions like yours, but actually degree programs like cognitive science.
It's really interesting. Great. Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Yes.
Thanks for your talk. I'm sort of curious, like you titled the report "Targeted Threats." A lot of what you discussed was targeted, but you also made the point that while there might be these interesting cases of dropping multiple 0 days to go after a single person, a lot of the attacks are much more just finding any sort of hacking tool that some criminals using and applying it. I guess I'm curious to get, based on your knowledge of how much of it is targeted or targeted in what way. In what way should our solutions lead to those targeted threats? Yeah. And to what extent do we improve things just by improving it for everyone?
Yeah, that's a great question.
When you're saying you're pessimistic, I guess I've been seeing some optimism that in some ways, like everyone now today uses much more secure tools than they did in 2013.
That's true.
Not because we convinced them all it was really important to invest in security. Because Gmail fixed things or WhatsApp uses a certain protocol.
Yeah, that's a very good. So on the what's targeted or not first part of that, I think it's important to distinguish between the sophistication of the tools or the technology being used versus the techniques that may be applied where the technology is not that sophisticated. They're still very highly targeted. They're just not using sophisticated technology. So a lot of the effort goes into the social engineering, trying to trick somebody into opening an attachment or clicking on a link. Doesn't necessarily mean they're using million-dollar exploits behind it, right? As long as it works. And that's also a cause for optimism because you can start educating people, and I didn't really get into that here, but we spend time trying to think through some of that to educate people about what to recognize. As here, look at the sender of the email. This is you can hopefully educate people to what to look for, how to behave in a way that improves their digital hygiene, regardless of what the companies are doing to improve things. Yeah, I do think when I said that I was being pessimistic, I am pessimistic about the larger context. I think there have been some improvements of the type that you're pointing out, especially after the Snowden disclosures, kind of ramping up of user security. I would also say there's the community of which I'm a part has now magnified, and it's much more well-resourced, and there are some really interesting things happening, including some great projects here at Berkeley. So I'm excited about that prospect. I see at universities people talking about, oh, we want to build a citizen lab. That, of course, that makes me feel good. I think there should be more of those. But generally speaking, when you look at the political context, I think it looks pretty bleak. And so that suggests to me that the challenges are going to get steeper before they get better. And of course, not everything's one direction, right? There are multiple things going on at once. Yes, back there.
My question is related to the growing numbers of seniors who are going online and who are becoming more digitally educated, but who are also probably the most vulnerable of the communities that are using online tools, and the necessity of perhaps connecting with medical records or whatever online provide plenty of opportunities for less sophisticated users of the internet to be taken advantage of in this way.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had heard of or are aware of any organizations that do either online or in-person sort of educational seminars about cybersecurity to prevent that kind of victimization.
Yeah. Well, I can say we at Citizen Lab have a project that we're working on that we haven't publicly announced widely yet. It was being broadcast on the internet, so I guess here we go, called Security Planner, that is meant to provide practical digital security advice to not high risk, not the type of people that Bill studies or we study, but to average users, consumers, including obviously seniors would be a very important demographic. And this comes from our frustration in seeing that there really is not something out there like that. That, there's a lot of folk wisdom or very, very confusing technical stuff that people have a hard time understanding. And of course, a little bit of security can be a bad thing. So if you do something, you think you're securing yourself, you're ending up putting yourself at greater risk. So we're creating this platform, which will be a portal. People are guided through questions, offered some recommendations, depending on what platform they're using or device they're using. It's meant to be agnostic at that level. But more importantly, it comes from a group of people who are experts. So it's peer reviewed, and there'll be expert opinion on this that'll help inform the recommendations and hopefully keep it up to date. So we intend to release that in July. So look for it then.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you have any information or evidence about targeting going on here in the United States? Activists, social justice organizations?
Well, certainly we get a lot of people who are concerned about that after the Trump administration. I think rightly so. I think it's important to think about the environment within which one works, though. And And so the type of targeting that we're seeing, I think, is unique to a particular type of person and maybe a particular type of threat actor. When you're inside a country, and a country has such extraordinary capabilities, I think that if there is targeting going on, we likely never see it in the type of research that we're doing because of access to infrastructure in ways that we just can't possibly document. That said, I think it's something we're looking at for sure. We want to look at different categories of civil society that we really haven't looked at before, and environmental areas, other areas that haven't really got our attention yet. Yes?
So on your last slide, you talked about cyberspace as a global commons and the stewardship aspect. And I'm just curious, what do you imagine as you look forward, given that the vast majority of our collaborative public spaces are corporately controlled?
Yeah, so it's definitely not a commons in the sense of the, great people at Berkeley who think about these things. So it's at best a mixed public-private commons. I think it's, and yet I think in my mind anyway, I don't see any incompatibility between that. I think that we have to be careful to properly apply mechanisms like antitrust to make sure that, to prevent monopolies from forming. I think we need to apply transparency metrics that we typically apply to governments, to the private sector, given the volume of data that they control and the power of algorithms. This is also why I feel very strongly about the reverse engineering work that we do. I see that as a kind of civic ethic. It's perverse to me that we live in a day and age where, if I open this iPhone, it's called jailbreaking. That to me is symptomatic of a kind of disease where we should be encouraging people to do the very opposite, which is to get inside the technology and explore it. And again, that would come, in my mind anyway, from a sense of stewardship over this space. So even though there are proprietary parts of it, those companies are having it entrusted to them. And we need to take a bit more ownership over it as users than we do now. Yes.
Great, thank you for your talk. Given the threats that you and your team are examining, I'm wondering if you have a sense of what type of regulatory regime you think is most appropriate to deal with the type of challenge that you're facing.
Mm-hmm.
Are we in a situation where we need an OWASP 3.0? What is the answer here in a space where you do have public actors, private actors, and what have you? Are states where we should be looking? I'm just wondering whether you have a sense of.
Sure, yeah. I'll just quickly say, because of time, that I just co-authored a paper, Who's Watching Little Brother, with my colleague Sarah McCune, precisely about this. So if you're interested, I think export controls are only one slice of the solution here. And because Wassenaar 1 or 2.0 was maybe poorly designed doesn't mean they can't be refined. I definitely think there's a role there. But we have to think about other mechanisms as well to hold these companies accountable. As I said, criminal law, civil law, other types of responses. One thing I will say, at an international level, I spend some time participating in and watching what goes on in what's called the cybersecurity norms area. This is primarily, the security elites of the major powers getting together and saying, how are we going to come to some condominium over cyberspace to prevent warfare from happening? I think that is actually counterproductive to the area that I'm concerned about, precisely because civil society is kind of being left hung out to dry. And that needs to change somehow. I don't feel very optimistic that it will anytime soon. For various reasons, but I think that's where it would have to come from.
We have time for one more question.
Or comment. Oh, there's one. Okay.
How have you seen the behavior of the people who you've worked with, like the victims, who are sort of everyday, the activists, the politically involved folks? How have you seen their behavior change, or have you seen it changing?
Well, unfortunately, Ahmed Mansour's in jail right now, so that's not good. You know, I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear what Bill thinks about that. Do you want to answer that, Bill? Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, it really varies. There's a variety of impacts from someone knowing that they're being spied on or being targeted with this spyware, both on the person and on their kind of network and contacts and community. So, for instance, in Morocco, one thing we saw when it was revealed that this organization, Munk, was a citizen journalist organization, was targeted by the government with hacking team spyware. They found it difficult to kind of continue their work with their contacts and sources because the contacts and sources said, "Oh, well, you guys are targeted, you guys are spied on. We don't feel comfortable with that." And that's another thing that I heard from. I heard that same thing from Ethiopian journalists that we work with. That there was a concern when we were doing this research. They said, "Bill, try to play up the fact that we didn't actually click on these links, so that people know that we're kind of on top of it, and that we can be trusted, and that people will continue to work with us." But on the specific victims themselves, I think I don't really see them changing their behavior that much. They say, "Oh well, okay, I know that this is a surveillance, that this is the type of surveillance I could be under, that I am under, and I'll just change my behavior accordingly. And if I'm more worried about my computer being hacked, then I'll just get another computer and work on that, and only do certain things on that." So I think for the most part, people just deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Appreciate you coming. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.